We now have approximately 30 members, including our 7 board members. And because of COVID, the AIA conference has become a virtual conference. So WDA is falling in line with that as a virtual conference as well. Next, please. If you could go to the next slide, please. One more slide, please. You're going to need to back up to the beginning of this slide deck. Thank you. So here is a list of our 7 board members. They are deaf, hearing, or hard of hearing, as well as some CODA members. And they participate in our team to establish this organization to ensure its effectiveness and cohesiveness with AIA. And they are very aware of that, of the conference and things that happen with AIA, and they help us to be in a line. What is WDA? So WDA is where myself and the 2 other co-founders encourage one another to be a part of AIA and work in tandem with the AIA for equity, diversity, and inclusion. And the other groups, there's one from Black, from Hispanic, from women, LGBTQ, that are involved with AIA because they didn't have groups for architects with disabilities. So that's kind of how WDA was established, to be that branch in order to start up that group for people with disabilities for AIA. So that's how WDA was established. And we work with the AIA organization as a consortium in order to build up those relationships with the membership of AIA. Because I believe they have about 94,000 members participating from different groups, different subcommittees for the AIA community. Next slide. So our group is similar to other groups: Black History Month, American Indian History, Women Architect Designs. We're trying to make an effort to establish and to share the common sense experience, as well as being those experts and the content expert with hearing professionals and how things can work, and working together with us so that we can educate them, as most of them are AIA representatives, are learning more about the benefits of hiring, developing, and promoting deaf and hard of hearing within the profession. Please go to the next slide. So these are some resources regarding our experiences and our practices within architecture, and things that needed to be improved for the deaf and hard of hearing professionals, and to learn how to communicate out with the outside professionals for a successful experience, as well as for students that are going through an architecture program, and to see what is happening for them nationwide, and to provide information from our experience within the profession to the up and coming student architects that are learning. And we work in all of the different facets of architecture. And as a collaborative group with deaf, hard of hearing, working together with other professions within the design field that have a hearing loss, as well as working internationally with people who maybe have never experienced working on a team with deaf and hard of hearing architects and designers, and learning how to communicate to be successful. Please go to the next slide. So the doers is what WDA is. And what the doers do for AIA and their knowledge community. We provide the information about communication access in the workplace as part of AIA's knowledge communities, that they don't have different experiences from us. So they're learning experiences from us as doers to the AIA knowledge community. So this image here shows critical information about how our group, compared to other groups, do things through the knowledge community. Learning how to manage with others. The term boss is what we don't want to do. If you're telling somebody you're a boss, then things are going to break down. But instead, mistakes might happen, and you have to learn, and you have to lead someone. Like myself, I ask the members and the board to give me their feedback of how I can change. We vote on different things, and it is very respectful with one another and with amongst our teams of how we coordinate and correlate with each other. This is another image where it's talking about leadership, and leadership is really critical for teamwork. It's understanding people who have different skills and different expertise. You know, the Army's troops need different leaders to help with different teams in order to be successful with minimal loss.
Okay.
And so you need to incorporate leadership when possible for future growth of a particular group. Martin Luther King always said, his very important words is, we should never give up. We need to continue to move towards change. The world needs to continue to learn, to change, and to help. We need to be able to improve. Communication with families, with society, for life purposes, in order to move forward and to push AIA's knowledge community agenda in order to change, to accommodate to our needs, to improve the communication and access for the future. Sadly, we don't have enough contact with them in order to move and to push and to cause this change. And we can't do it without fighting, we want to do this without fighting and getting upset. We want to do it with patience to cause change and to make things more positive and to achieve success and to achieve our goals. Next slide. Okay, so this quote from Winston Churchill is showing us that we need to be more courageous. We need to be more brave. And we need to do things without fear in the world. That's how myself and others grew up in one world, learning to have peace, to have courage, and to be in one group, and to understand that you're going to face new challenges, new faces of the world that will need our ability to improve communication, to improve partnership and collaboration with other organizations. Next slide, please. So the difference between equity and equality, they are separate, they are different, and they have different meanings. Equality is people with disabilities, disabled architects, deaf architects, blind architects, deaf blind, anyone with physical disabilities, needing something more accessible in order to complete their job or their tasks. That's where ADA has their requirements for providing things in an accessible way. For example, with any organization that has 15 people or more is then required under ADA for a deaf person to provide a sign language interpreter at work or outside of work and other entities. Whereas equity is not really equal. Sometimes it's not perfect. Sometimes it is well. It's a difficult way for an architect to be up to date with the new programs in order to help people with disabilities to make things as a more equal opportunity and to have more opportunities and more places. So equity is different from equality. Equity is where a company with 15 people or less who are not required by ADA to provide because of an undue circumstances. And an architect then needs to figure out how to work with a team to help engagement with one another, to allow for a deaf architect to be involved, not miss out on anything. If they are not able to provide a sign language interpreter, then they need to have some other type of technical tool for communication in order to help with that architect. For example, maybe captioning or using an interpreter in a remote setting, or working with another team member in order to share with one another to ensure that everything is equitable for success. Please go to the next slide. So this image that you're seeing here, this shows the difference between equity and equality, and you'll be able to see a visual representation of what that means. So equality is saying everybody has exactly the same thing. And so you have a short person who has the exact same tools provided to them as a tall person, but they're still not getting the same experience. It's difficult for them. And potentially this company doesn't know how to provide access in the right way. Whereas equity is giving people in a certain category the assistance and the tools that they need to cause change. So in this case, the shorter person has a higher box to stand on to be able to see, and therefore having an equitable experience as the others that are participating. So this problem you can solve all of these issues by justice, which is, if you look at this picture, allowing change to provide an individual with disabilities to have an equitable experience with others and resolve the design issue that is coming from. And that is part of equity. Please go to the next slide. So this is what happens between the internal and external people when you're looking at the design with, okay, you're looking at Hispanic and women. As these people are coming into a place, it's as though it's a factory where people learn different accessible ways, and they have different relationships with their cultures and how they succeed and how they choose their teams for different people from different backgrounds with different experiences for their participatory reasons. And this is an effective way to ensure that the teams work together. So the picture on the right is showing the team process being successful. So please go to the next slide. So equal is everyone is equal. That's important for people to understand. And we need to think about positive, equitable opportunities. So thinking about salary, everybody should be on the same page. They should, if they have the same level of education, same level of experience, same level of qualifications on a certain area, then you should have equitable pay for equitable work within a team. Next slide. So the picture on the left shows one colored flower. So therefore showing that that is an individual with a disability or with a different background environment. And they're entering into a world where other people from other backgrounds will have to, and they will have to learn to change to adapt to those backgrounds in order to have things more equitable for them. And then you can see that the other picture is showing them all being equal together in the same image. So this is a picture of our WDA conference in the different cities that we have been thus far since we were established in 2016. We had meetings during the AIA conference when they were geographical in other cities, in Philadelphia, as well as in Orlando, New York, and in Las Vegas. And then last year during the summer, of course, the conference was canceled due to the pandemic. And this summer is the first time of us having an opportunity to convene via virtual manners. This is a great time for socialization and to hang out after the meetings. And we want to be able to share our experience about communication and work, as well as we invite others to come and to speak to us and to show their slides about accessibility in construction, architecture, communication, and access for people. So hopefully next year, when the pandemic has resolved, we will find a city and figure out where we can have our next conference in person. I was invited by one of the board members to present and to share, to show a little bit of different backgrounds. There was somebody who was a woman who was Black, as well as a Hispanic, and then myself. And the three of us went to the New York chapter of AIA. There were about 15 or 20 people there who didn't know anything about communication access. And so they had the opportunity to change and to learn. It was really a wonderful exposure for these people, with my presentation for them at that time, as well as their future careers. Next slide, please. WDA can establish training programs for 5 different events, such as architecture schools and continuing education, where we are training architecture students who are going into that field in the future. We do that through video communication. We do that through conferences with students. Sometimes we do on-site visits to these students. When we were in New York, we did that at the New York School for the Deaf. And we teach these students what is necessary to become an architect. And sometimes we've gone into some of the other state chapters of AIA to educate them more about communication access with deaf and hard of hearing architects. We also work with the knowledge communities and networks involved with AIA and their knowledge communities to send out more information to them so that they're able to learn. We do training sessions and workshops through AIA at the state and local chapters, as well as with other private firms. We have communication access improvement and effectiveness with the knowledge communities. July 26th, 2021, as was the 31st anniversary of ADA and the signing of ADA into law for people with disabilities. And then after that, the Federal Communication Commission, the FCC, established the telecommunication relay services 30 years ago for all of us, as well as private companies and individuals, in order to utilize video communication and text communication in different manners in order to improve our communication access. Next slide, please. If you need more information about WDA, please feel free to look at our website, which is www.worlddeafarchitecture.org. And if you're interested in joining and becoming a member, please do. And if you'd like to donate for fundraising efforts for our future events, please make sure to donate on that page as well. If you have any questions, please email me for more information regarding our organization. Thank you. And now we have our next speaker, who is John Stanton, and he is the president of our board. So please welcome John.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our WDA Symposium. Unfortunately, our policy and dialogue was not able to be accessed during the presentation. So I'm really sorry about that. Your questions might have been missed. So please make sure you input them in that Q&A box. Also, we love feedback from all the participants. So please put all your comments in the chat box as well. Okay, so I have my first slide here. These are our 2021 Board of Directors. And this has been developed, 5 years in the process. And WDA through maybe 15 to 20 directors. I can explain more on that later, what has been going on within our organization and our organization structure. So I hope you'll be excited about what I have to share. First, on the board, I'm the president. My name is John. I go by JP. Then vice president is Jade, sorry. And the superintendent is Deborah. Or Debbie. And then fourth member at large. We have 4 members at large. We have Miguel. We have Chris. We have Shu and Gray. And MIA, people missing in action here. We're missing a secretary, and we desperately need one because we have so many different deaf types of people, which include hard of hearing people who use sign language or hard of hearing people who do not use sign language. We have hearing people. We have so many diverse members, and it's been really difficult for the deaf and hard of hearing to comprehend everything or try to pay attention and participate in a meeting and take notes simultaneously. And we need to record our minutes. So it's been very difficult up until now. So we are searching for a secretary. The other missing position that we need to fill, it's really, really missed. It's really just fallen on the wayside, is Robert. And he is currently our executive director. So next slide, please. So here for 2021, these are our WDA projects that we're working on. So we have our financial reports, our membership development, our fundraising and endowments, and our mentoring programs. And that includes students, employees, and employers. It's a really great program. And then the fifth one are events. We do have a deaf space workshop. That is in the works. It's in development stages right now. And obviously we're here. So this is our annual symposium with AIA. And then we have marketing for number 6. And marketing entails a website and newsletters. And last but not least, number 7 is organization. Which now we are trying to currently restructure within the organization, as well as amendments to our bylaws. So what this means, I understand it's a very long list. We have 7 huge projects. Plus, on top of that, we have 10 sub-projects. So all in all, we have 17 items that we are constantly discussing every month. So, and speaking of that, it's about only about a half hour. So it feels like we're rushing through and running around through topics quickly. We don't feel we have enough time. Or we could go up to 2 hours sometimes and still not feel like we have enough time. So I don't even know how that's possible. Especially with the amount of work that we've been doing with WDA. And we are also, full-time employees. This is not our full-time job to be on this board. So the current structure, I would like to explain what about our bylaws and what some of our issues have been. Milestones and timelines and issues. So as of 2016, we had 3 directors. And they were the founding fathers. And they were so excited and so motivated to, share their seniority. And their studies and developments of WDA. And they sacrificed their time and they sacrificed their studies and to help develop their Saturdays for WDA. And then fast forward to 2017, we had 4 directors, but the 4th director didn't last a long time. So now we move forward to 2018. And we had 11 directors, 2 back directors, former directors who, when I came in and became a member of WDA was in 2018 in November. And there was a huge amount of change with the board of directors within 2018 and 2019. So in 2019, we ended up with 9 directors on the board, 4 former directors. And that year became, we established our first, I became vice president. And the second founding member resigned, but remained, the only remaining founder is Robert. So considering that it's the, second Saturday's meetings that we're sacrificing, it's a big issue. It's not sustainable. So for 2020, 6 of the directors, 7 of the former directors, the 7 former directors went ahead and resigned. So at that point, I became president. One huge issue was changing the meeting time from Saturdays to Sunday meetings. And that didn't last either. After 2 months, we realized it wasn't working. So we changed it to every second Tuesday after dinner time. So usually in the evening about 5 p.m. Next slide, please. So here is the chart of the current WDA structure. You can see Robert is the executive director. And underneath Robert, you have all the board members. So the president, vice president, project committee, treasurer, secretary, etc. So we have 7 people currently working on different projects. So it's been very tough. We've been really advocating to try to keep that growing. And this structure currently isn't really working for us. So my thoughts and my thinking process right now is what we're going to do to stop the runaround. And we really need to make this work better with our current members and restructure. So we really need to reduce our number of projects or maybe find some volunteers who would be willing to help us manage the current projects that we have, because so many people have said they want to join, want to become members, they want the experience and the exposure, and they would love to be on the board. So we've been sort of trying to keep them a limit at 7 because, we're already having 1.5 hour meetings, and sometimes they go up to 2 hours and it's already too much. So what do we do with that? Also, the projects that we've already been developing, we need to finish, and then we can, they've just been sitting there and collecting dust. We can't manage what we currently have taken on. And then we keep being asked to start more projects. So next slide, please. So here's the bigger picture, our vision for the new WDA board. It's a lot more evidence on what, it looks almost the same. It just looks a little bit, it's structured a little more easily for this board to have, less stress put onto them, and maybe less project responsibility, and more sustainable. And we can manage, the directors will be able to manage, and the executive director and administration can be in better positions, financially and for fundraising, and have more control of the budget and the finances. And then the second part of that is the colorful, more colorful picture of Robert that you see here. The last slide showed a much darker photo. It was grayish, and it doesn't represent the happiness of this group. So we decided this structure would be better and more valuable for our future and the future of WDA. So the executive director it needs to be more delegating, needs to delegate more work to more volunteers under Robert's direction, or the directors, the board of directors. And hopefully we'll be more motivated to be more, have more, be able to benefit from more volunteer or more staff. We're hoping to have more volunteers because they would help us, the directors from staff in the future. So the future directors need this. And also, it's very important that we maintain the projects that we've already developed. I really hope that my participants will help, and my presentation helped, that you understand what has been going on for the larger and growing WDA and fiscal future. And I'm looking forward to this organization, and I'm really hoping to share this information with all of you, and that you can share it with other participants and they can join us in our cause here at WDA. Thank you. And I'm going to turn this back over to Robert. Robert here. Thank you so very much, John, for that wonderful presentation, really explaining how the structure looks and on the WDA board. And we're hoping that we can successfully grow and change our team and change our structure moving forward. And I hope that we can fill those two roles and positions that we are looking for. So if anyone is interested, please email your interest, explain why you would like to be on the board, and access it through our website, or my email. And I mentioned that before. So now we have our next presenter. We're going to go ahead and start early. And then I guess at 11:55 so that we have more time to have the presentation set up. So I'd like to tell you about the next person who will be presenting today. Her name is Karen Braitmayer. And she is a fellow AIA member. She herself is in a wheelchair, and she has been since a child. She went to school of architecture to get her master's of architecture from the University of Houston. And prior to that, she received her bachelor's degree of art from Rice University. And she established her own firm that's called Studio Pacifica. And they specialize and focus on accessibility design for a wide variety of structures all around the state and the country. So her work is very important. She works with clients such as Starbucks to make sure that customers have accessibility from the front door all the way to the counter. I went to a Starbucks near my house, and I was so impressed with that design. So I asked them, who designed this? And they let me know. It was Karen Braitmayer. So I just was so highly impressed by her. And Karen has now received an award from the American Institute of Architecture in 2019. And it was the Whitney Young Award. And that is a special award for civic rights. So Karen has been involved and been such a big advocate for people who have disabilities in the community. And she was chosen to be the president of, under Obama, to be the chair of the US Accessibility Board. So right now, I am very, very pleased to have our presenter here, Karen Braitmayer. So everyone help me in welcoming her.
Hi, I am just thrilled. Thank you so much to World Deaf Architecture and Robert Nichols for inviting me to speak today. I'm wondering if everybody is seeing me as a highlight. So if it's possible for me to be on the big screen for a few minutes before my slide presentation, that would be great. I'm speaking to you today from my office in Seattle, and I want to acknowledge that I am a guest on this land, home of the Duwamish and Coast Salish people. You know, I'm going to start talking to you today by sharing 3 questions that I often get asked. What was life like for a person with a disability prior to the ADA? What buildings or places do I think successfully go beyond the regulations? And what still needs to be done to assure great access? So, what was life like prior to the ADA? Well, let's just start with that many people with disabilities, like myself, 40 or 50 years ago, believed that we had to adapt to the built environment. It wasn't going to change for us. We had to change to match it. My first inclination that perhaps that didn't need to be true, I think was really like when I started architecture school. I imagine this, you know, I walked into design studio on the first day and I was faced with a sea of tall drafting tables. And I was sitting down here in my wheelchair and looking up at them and going, oh, this is going to be hard. But my classmates, they, at the end of class, got together, got some supplies, pried the top off that drafting table and built a new base. And all of a sudden, I was able to do all this, you know, same stuff that my classmates were able to do because the table fit me. Later, I was having some issues. You know, we were all staying late at night at design studio, and I was having a lot of trouble getting to the parking lot late at night in my wheelchair. So that same group of students went out, bought some yellow safety paint and a sign, and painted an accessible parking space right next to the design studio. So I do not suggest, you know, that kind of subversive behavior. But what it did show me is that, you know, we can make change in our environment and it can suit people. And it was really my first concrete example that changing my environment could change my abilities. You know, I really am a little bit intimidated about talking in front of a group such as you today. Do I really know enough about the experiences of deaf architects to present to you? You know, this is not really an area of my expertise, but I will admit that I am learning. I've been a wheelchair user my whole life, but I'm just beginning to personally understand the professional challenges that come with profound hearing loss. So today, I'd like to learn from you, even as I share my experiences and thoughts. So I'd love to have the slides come up, please. You have the power to create a beautifully accessible world. Next slide, please. You also have the power to be both a good designer and a design activist. Next slide, please. So, are you ready? We're going to start with the story behind the passage of the ADA. You might think that the architecture community had a large role in the passage of the ADA and other very significant legislation that, affect our work and what we do. But the truth is that really it's people with disabilities, their advocates and allies that were the primary drivers who led the charge. Next slide, please. So here we see an image of World War II veterans that are advocating for their rights. So thanks to medical advances, right? People who were injured with spinal cord injuries in World War II were living. They were actually coming home. And, if you can tell, they're all sitting in exactly the same wheelchair. So thank God that's changed. And they wanted to live a full life. Back then, the idea of accessibility was really just a dream. So they focused their energy on getting the service benefits that they were offered. Eventually they got them, but what emerged from their efforts was far greater. Next slide, please. So more and more people got involved. They kind of got behind this idea of accessibility. In the 40s, parents of children with disabilities began to demand access to education and services for their kids. Those kids grew up, and in turn, they began to advocate for personal autonomy and guaranteed civil rights for all people of all abilities. As a side note, some of you who grew up after the passage of the ADA may not realize that when I was young, late 60s, early 70s, going to your local elementary school, if you had an accessibility or communication need, was not a given. In many cases, not even a possibility. Sadly, many students, even today, are not fully supported in their education goals in integrated environments. Really, this has got to change. Next slide, please. So we have in the 70s, well, even at the late 60s, but in the 70s, definitely, the disability rights movement was like gathering steam. It was a national force to contend with. They looked to the civil rights movement for methods and support. People with disabilities were asking for full access to buildings, education, transportation, everything. And think about it. If you can't get on public transportation, how do you get to your school or hold down a job or go grocery shopping or participate in community events? Transportation was one of the first and still continues to be most important areas that we need to continue to work on. I actually flew on an airplane not long ago. And, for many of us who use wheelchairs, the sort of scary part of being flying on an airplane is wondering what's going to happen to your mobility device when it's down in the belly of the plane. But I was pleasantly surprised to be able to watch a movie at my seat with captioning. So there are some steps forward, but certainly not enough. So 31 years ago today, or not today, 31 years ago this month, the ADA was passed. And that has made such a difference. Think about how many curb ramps and parking spaces and other features are now available that were not 40 years ago. But still, full access is not a given. People like you and I are working on it. Next slide, please. So people with disabilities continue to advocate professionally and personally for change that supports true diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. I love this phrase, disability rights, our civil rights. And I just want to put a little pitch in here now. If you want a more interesting and engaging description of how the disability rights movement came to pass, watch Crip Camp. It's a documentary streaming on Netflix, and it's just an engaging and informative sort of view into the birth of the disability rights movement. And I think one of the things that's important in it is that it highlights how valuable it was to have people of all strengths, you know, folks with mobility issues, hearing issues, vision issues, all working together, using their skills to protest and to win. Next slide, please. Spurred on by equity protests, major brands are going out to promote this concept of diversity and inclusion, and they are actually including disability, which I love. So, you know, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, they're all trying to identify that they support disability as a part of their diversity efforts. They're really looking to substantially shift their real estate development focus to include access for people with a full spectrum of needs. So it's important for all of us to know how we can work together to get that done. Next slide, please. So when it comes to accessible design, are you clear on the difference between environments that aim to be code compliant and environments that strive to be inclusive to all? That's what I'm hoping to talk more about as we move forward. Next slide. It's easy for us to say, you know, let's go beyond the access regulations and create something that's design fabulous. So what I'm going to show you are some really great projects that took a creative leap, plus maybe one that didn't quite make it. Next slide, please. And just in case it's not obvious, I am hoping that today I'm going to make some accessibility allies that will spread the word. You know, accessibility can be beautiful. Next slide. Another way to tell if a project works for everyone is to look at the face of a person with access needs as they navigate the space. And yes, that's me on the upper deck of the Seattle Space Needle, clearly thrilled that what was inaccessible to me before is now wonderfully accessible. My office worked with Olson Kundig, a firm here in Seattle, during the renovation to include a new in-floor platform lift that allows access for wheelchair users from the interior level to the lower outer observation deck. And the other thing they did, which I think, you know, creates a thrilling experience for everyone, no matter your eye level, is lowering the glass all the way to the platform edge. Now, so, you know, you don't have to be like trying to peer over the handrail. I will say, I am terrified of heights. So it's amazing that they got me out there. But you know what? It's thrilling. And I encourage you, anytime that you come to Seattle, that you get out and try to see it and recognize how seamless the passage is to get out to that deck. Next slide, please. So everyone just wants to live a full life. It doesn't matter what how you communicate or how you move. You just want to, do things with family and friends, get to pursue your passions. And that's exactly what we do professionally at Studio Pacifica, and why we are encouraging you to take a look at what can be done when both a designer and a client are committed to creating beautifully accessible environments. Next slide, please. So, people with disabilities are called a minority. But the truth is, we're a really, really big minority. There are 61 million Americans with a disability. That's basically 1 in 4 adults. So that number, that 61 million, does not count the young people under the age of 18, of which there are, clearly many. And it's important to recognize that these like architectural features that are supposed to be special for, that minority, they really benefit everybody. Using a lever door handle means that you can open a door if your arms are full of things. You can use your elbow, as well as making it possible for someone who has arthritis or difficulty grasping. I think it's important to understand that everyone benefits from these features. Next slide, please. So lately, I've gotten a lot of calls from clients that want to hire us to make their projects universally accessible. And I have to ask them, so what does that term mean to you? Because actually, there's no definition of universally accessible. Certainly, our firm does a lot of work that is accessible, which would mean that you're complying with code. But these firms want to do more. They are trying to achieve accessibility for everyone with exactly the same solution. Next slide, please. So really, is perfection possible? And what should we be aiming for? I think when people set impossible goals, maybe designers can get intimidated and possibly decide, oh, you know what, I'm just going to meet the regulations because I don't want to get it wrong if I'm trying to be creative here. So here are 3 things that I advise my clients to do. First, provide options and choices for how people interact with the environment. An example might be providing the same toilet accessory, like a paper towel dispenser, at different heights in the toilet room, or providing different widths of seats in the auditorium. The second thing to do is to learn about regulations and codes so that you can find those clues to the areas for how to go beyond. An example might be noticing that when a code dimension is 34 inches maximum, that lower might be okay, versus a dimension that says it's 18 inches exactly. Then you only have a tiny bit of wiggle room for that dimension. The code might say that accessible parking must be at least 5% of all parking spaces. That's your clue to know that more than 5% is good or better. And lastly, the third thing that you can do to help people understand is talk to folks with lived experience for their suggestions. People with disabilities are great innovators. They have hacks and ideas. Think about it. Most of us have had to make accommodations to get the environment to fit to us for years. We can often rattle off a list of changes that would make a positive benefit not only to the disability community, but to everyone. So 3 things: provide options and choices, learn more about your codes and regulations, and include people with lived experience. Next slide, please. So enough, chatting. Let's get to our first great example. In honor of the 2021 Olympic Games, we thought we would feature the stellar design and the stellar accessibility focus of the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Museum in Colorado. When it came to access, the architects worked with many Paralympic athletes, as well as an accessibility project consultant, a person with lived experience, in order to design at the architecture level that they hoped. Now, isn't that a stunning building? Next slide, please. I do need to regress for just a minute. Yes, regrettably, this negative stereotype, handicapped design, is inherently ugly, still pops up. Next slide, please. So, new thinking, inclusive design is a creative opportunity. This is why I'd like to get agreement from everyone listening here today that the time has come to not only welcome, but celebrate inclusive design. Next slide, please. So we're back at the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Museum. The architect is Diller Scofido Renfro, and the access consultant is I Design Access. So really, the New York Times wrote a fabulous article saying that the museum's notable attribute was its high level of accessibility. Basically, the museum is designed so that when you come in, you go to the top floor, and then there's a gentle ramp that goes around. And so you sort of move down through the building, visiting each of the galleries. So it's a low effort and like easy pathway to take. I was also very excited to meet Ileana Rodriguez. She is the founder of I Design Access. She's a Paralympic swimmer, and she became an architect to support the design of spaces that embrace and honor the diversity of athletes in sport. And I was thrilled to learn about a person who wanted to be able to contribute their personal passion, sport, and then use architecture to create spaces that allow other people to do that. Next slide, please. So in that same New York Times article, they stated that accommodations are the norm at this museum. So here's some examples they gave. The ramps are all very low slope, and they're all wide enough to fit 2 wheelchairs side by side. Sign language interpreters appear in the corners of all videos. Cane guards double as benches in the building's atrium. And actually, in this slide, you can see in the left corner, because there are all those exciting angled walls that, those could be a head bump experience for folks in the low vision or blind community. So they have provided benches and protection below that low ceiling, low head height. When people enter, everyone gets a badge on a lanyard. They are then guided to a nearby kiosk to register any of their special communication needs, such as enlarged type, audio versions of text, or reduced sensory triggers. And then as you move through the exhibits, apparently sensors recognize your badge, and they customize the displays automatically. There's no need to adjust things at each exhibit. So, I mean, those are really beautiful and innovative ways to engage all of the visitors at the museum. But I have to ask, should these be thought of as accommodations or really just brilliant and inclusive design and the way every museum should be? Next slide, please. We know that accessibility serves people with mobility issues. It also serves people with hearing, visual impairments, and those who have hidden disabilities, although perhaps not quite as in quite as much detail. So that was the creative challenge that the museum design team embraced and succeeded, recognizing that even within the disability community, we need to acknowledge and embrace our diversity. Next slide, please. So here we are at the deep dive. This is a speakeasy, or really just a bar in Seattle that I worked on with Grandbaba Architects. You know, when people go out to have fun, they just want to like sit with their friends. But even when designers follow the accessibility rules and regulations, that does not guarantee a truly inclusive solution. For example, the regulations tell us that if you build a bar, like, you know, this at a restaurant or whatever, you must have accessible seating at that bar. So typically designers take the 42-inch high bar top and they drop it to 34 inches for a seat or two. Well, that means when you go out with your friends, you're sitting down here and everybody's sitting up there, and it's not really quite the same chumminess that you would like to have at a bar. In this photo, I want to point out that there is a level change in this space. You know, when we first saw the space as a raw space, we were like, oh man, this is going to be a real pain, because, you know, you come in at one height, you go down, you go back up another like 6 or 8 inches. We're thinking, oh, this is going to be hard. But in the end, we were able to make it work for us. So the bar spans that raised floor height. You can see in the left-hand side of the image, there's the accessible seating of the bar, and then the floor drops down, and the remainder of the bar seating is at 42 inches. So when you come to this, the deep dive, you can sit at the bar with your friends eye to eye. Yes, indeed, we do have a ramp. You can see the curved ramp in the right corner. There's light on the floor that shows that. And there is an opening behind that wall that gets you into the space if you want to sit at the banquette. So it's really accessible. But, you know, I really think of this as a design win-win. So sometimes those really difficult, like existing spaces can work out great. Next slide, please. Here we are at the Ed Roberts campus in Berkeley. And boy, this spiral ramp, that is not only a joyous experience. I've ridden on it, it's really fun. Well, actually more fun going down than going up. But there are elevators, thank heavens. But it's also an iconic example of expressing the needs of the individuals who are working in that building. What was the one thing that made a creative difference here? Of course, the fantastic design team Letty, Natum, Stacy architects. But the important thing is that people with disabilities were intimately involved in the building's design process because it's home to many disability organizations. So here's a challenge for you. When you design a project that has a spectacular access feature, like shown here, or even if you design a project that perhaps is a little less drama, because really that's a lot of drama, but nevertheless has creative accessibility solutions, I encourage you to pitch a story about it to the architectural press. It's one way to be a great designer and a design activist. Let's get more examples of great design out there. Next slide, please. So this is the Hunters Point Community Library. There's been a lot of controversy around this library. Certainly the design is quite impressive. The architecture press loved it. The local media was very excited. It was a big step forward for their community. But is it really great architecture if it's not inclusive or available to all users? As it stands, there are places in this library where the only access point is by stairs, the most prominent of which we're looking at here. These are the book stacks for kind of current fiction. And if I wanted to go pick my next beach read, I would have to ask a librarian to go get those books for me. I think this flies in the face of the idea behind access for all. So if you're thinking about making access for your building, ask yourself, is a building great public architecture if not everyone can use it? Next slide, please. Here we are at another strong example of multi-sensory experiences that embrace the diversity within the disability community. Here at the understory, an open to the public information center about the Amazon spheres. The design invites everyone to enjoy the experience. We know much focus is really made on mobility aid users. And of course, not just wheelchair users, but all ranges of ability. Canes, walkers, scooters. And if some of you have rolled a toddler in a stroller through a crowded retail store, you've had a firsthand glimpse into the life of a mobility aid user. This space provides multisensory exhibits that pair visual and audible and tactile information at every exhibit. There are hands-on opportunities to explore models of the structure of the building, of the way those crazy structural ribs that you're seeing through the window, what it's like for those. Opportunities to touch and feel live plants, because basically the Amazon sphere is a giant conservatory packed full of exotic plants. And to see and hear the same information about the plants, about the building's mission, about the building's construction. And yes, people with disabilities were involved in the design process for these exhibits. Next slide, please. So I mentioned choice and how much I value choice in earlier comments. Well, here's a strong example. Next slide, please. So here we are at Smith Plaza at the University of New Mexico. So this is a photo of a renovation of a large plaza, and it does have it's connecting to some existing walkways to the front of a building. And so people are coming from 5 different directions into this center space. But a singular design decision was made here that makes it easy for people who are in the blindness community to move comfortably through the middle of this wide open space. And frankly, this is very unusual. So people in the blindness community need a tactile reference point. And normally that's found at the perimeter. It might be the intersection between the floor surface and the edge of a planter. It might be a landscape bed. It might be a curb. But whatever it is, it's typically on the edge of this open round space. If you were to try to cross across the middle, in essence, take the shortcut that many of us with vision do, you are left with no reference points. You have no idea where you are. So here, a tactile material was installed on the floor plane down the middle of the plaza. The material contrasts in color and in texture to the surrounding surface so that it can be followed using either a white cane or your residual vision. And this one decision made it possible for everyone to enjoy the whole of the space. This is another example of thoughtful and beautiful access. Next slide, please. So we all know that the existing regulations and codes around accessibility don't equitably address the needs of the deaf or hard of hearing community or the blind or low vision community. The good news is that we're not waiting for the federal government to come up with new regulations. There is work being done by members of our community. And that takes me to the innovation that is deaf space. Next slide, please. Now, I assume that deaf space is not news to this audience, but regrettably, it is certainly news to most architects. Deaf space is a remarkable guide. Together, architects and designers with lived experience brought forth what I think of as the most innovative disability-related design concept in recent years, addressing the sensory and spatial benefits of designing to accommodate deaf and hard of hearing people. Can a building enhance communication among deaf people? Can a greater sense of security and awareness of your surroundings be provided? Well, buildings on the Gallaudet campus were test projects, and they demonstrate unequivocally the answer is yes. Clearly, this is important to the deaf and hard of hearing community, and y'all should be super proud of that work. But why is this important to the architecture community as a whole? Because it demonstrates that bringing together designers and people with lived experience, hopefully some of those also being designers, can culminate in new expressions of design and the way architecture affects our physical and sensory experiences. Accessibility has focused on removing barriers to people, largely people who use mobility devices. DevSpace shows that sensitively designed architecture can make everyone's experiences richer and more satisfying. And it kind of turns on its head that whole meet the minimums attitude of barrier removal, and more on the focus of how to create spaces that do more or enhance our lives. To me, DevSpace is a physical manifestation of a community culture. Next slide. So we have been talking about design and how architects can creatively address diverse needs. But there's another point of diversity I'd like to address. When it comes to diversity, as you know, people with disabilities are practically invisible in architecture and related professions. I firmly believe that if our profession is committed to reaching the next level of design excellence, we need to change this. How would we do that? Okay, so here are some ideas. Architecture schools must make a dedicated effort to increase diversity by reaching out and welcoming students with disabilities. Architecture firms must be encouraged to increase diverse perspectives in their workforce by hiring and supporting the careers of architects with disabilities. This means making hiring procedures fully accessible. You know, why are people having to do their first interview on the phone? Through making work accommodations fully available. The best and the brightest employees may come in a body that is different than what employers expect. And the AIA, an organization that is intended to represent its members, needs to make a significant contribution to changing this lack of representation through education and through outreach, and by offering scholarships to students with disabilities. What a difference it might make to a high school student who gets a brochure on, hey, wouldn't you like to be an architect, if they saw someone in that brochure that looked like them. And I applaud today World Deaf Architecture for supporting and working actively towards this critical diversity goal. Next slide, please. If you're going to take away anything from this presentation, I hope that, next slide, please. I hope it's the knowledge that you as an architect have the power to change people's lives. Next slide, please. As well as a better understanding today of why accessible design is a social justice issue. Next slide, please. Thank you for listening today, and thank you for using your power. Next slide, please. Maybe it's time to hand this off to Robert. Yeah.
Oh,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation and your slides. There's true value in the slide representation that you've had, things that we had never known. So I appreciate your wonderful presentation with a variety of buildings, accessibility, as well as showing social justice. Where people with disabilities need to live and work in the mainstream society. And are able to do that through your design. And this is wonderful. What beautiful slides. So now we're going to go ahead and go to the question and answer portion and see if anybody has left any questions for us in the Q&A box.
I'm sorry, I saw that they had a question by one person who asked Karen. I will start that before we give an answer. I wanted to ask Karen. It's a very important question. What does the future of social justice design by universal design, such as yourself, your firm, and a few other professionals, how do you think that will impact the world, and how do you think that can change to have it become more mainstream? Let me back up and explain myself a little more in depth. ADA was not the first law related to accessibility. It was, prior to that, it was ABA, the Association, or I'm sorry, America Barrier Association or Administration, and it was not completely fair. It wasn't equitable. And then they passed another that the people who passed it, this other law, did not have the background of any sort of accessibility, and they had no one on the board. So that had experience with disability or had just experienced any sort of discrimination from the beginning to the ADA when it was finally established. And that was established in 1990. And prior to that, universal design in America was set by another person in a wheelchair, another architect named
Ron Mace.
Say it again.
Ron Mace.
Ron Mace. And I met him and I asked him if he thought that would change design around the world and teach people to think differently. And I hoped it would affect the accessibility in the future. So at that point, myself, being deaf and any other people with disabilities, including yourself, Karen, in a wheelchair, I feel like it's so important to emphasize this to architects today. So now I've seen you've talked about, the Hunter Library and how it is not accessible in Queens. And that was designed by Stephen Hill. And I want to say that is just awful. There's a reason why, architects need to be aware, and sometimes they are aware and still choose to ignore it. So there is a reason why the, architecture field is so competitive. And sometimes people will try to get business without realizing that they're causing themselves more issues when it comes to accessibility. And they might end up having to redesign something because of it. So what is your opinion with AIA? And how do you think it will change? And what kind of training can we provide to help improve the future of design? What would your opinion on that be?
That's a long and complicated question, Robbie. I'll take pieces of it. How about that? So you're right that prior to the ADA, there were regulations that were developed by the Access Board to support access to the federal government, to buildings that were owned or leased by the federal government or that provide federal services. And it was not as robust as the ADA. And that was one of the first protests sort of that kind of solidified the disability rights movement, was a protest to get the 504 regulations actually enforced. But then people thought, okay, great that I can get into a federal building, but I just want to go to the grocery store or, to my community center. So the ADA was written to address all public accommodations. So it broadened the scope of buildings, and it used some updated information about how people with disabilities interact with the environment. But you have to remember, if it was passed in 1990, it was written probably years before that. So now here we are. There was an update in 2004 that was enforced in 2010. We are now 11 years past that. And there are more differences in the way people with disabilities want to interact. So first of all, why do we have a requirement even in place for public telephones when almost everybody uses personal devices? Technology is moving at a light speed, and the federal regulations are not keeping up with that. In addition, the technology for people who use mobility devices has changed dramatically. If you think about that photo of the people with the World War II veterans, and they were all sitting in what you might think of as a traditional hospital wheelchair. Well, now there's electric mobility devices, there's scooters, there's all sorts of stuff. So the regulations are having a hard time keeping up. I do agree. I think universal design has a ton of potential. The challenge is that there's not really a way to know if you got there. Like, did you achieve actually universal stuff? Because there's not the numbers that you can use in the federal regulations to tell you whether or not you achieved accessibility. So this is why I think we need more involvement of people with disabilities in the design process who can look at those universal design solutions, those really interesting and creative solutions, and say, yes, that's going to work, or not sure about that. Let's not try that one, So is it making a change? Yes. I mean, think about it. When I was a kid, there wasn't a parking space, an accessible parking space available. You couldn't sit in a movie theater in a wheelchair. I mean, I was asked as a young person, the only place I could sit in a movie theater when I was a kid was in the aisle. And I was told that I was a fire hazard. So, and now I can go, well, I haven't been to a movie in a year and a half, but after the pandemic is over and I go to a movie, I can get caption glasses and watch captions in a movie theater. That's amazing to me. Now, would it be awesome if there was more, if every movie, every theater? Yes. I definitely think there's a long way to go. But I think there's been a lot of change so far.
Okay, here's a question. Thank you, Karen, for sharing your answers. Question for Robbie. Are there any mentorship programs for deaf students and junior employees? How about outreach, finding more deaf architect students, employees, employers, including deaf quota, etc.?
Thank you, John. I read the same question in the Q&A box as well myself, so I'm happy to answer that question about in regards to deaf students and working with architects, like maybe part-time work. First of all, from my own experience, I have had 3 different deaf students that have worked with me in the past. When the 3 of those students were at Gallaudet and the School of Architect at the University of Maryland, and one was at the Catholic University of American School of Architecture. The other one was from George Washington University. And I had those students work with me, and I was more than happy to monitor them and share my experiences with them in the outside world and, help with communication. And it was just so valuable to help their learning, because not only from a design perspective, but they wanted to, be trained like I was trained. So I was able to give them that information, in all facets of architecture and how we service our customers. And, they didn't know what they would be doing after they graduated. So they got to see what that looked like. So when I started my first job after I graduated from my School of Architecture, I had nothing. I didn't know anything from hearing architects. They didn't share anything with me. So I felt like I really had to be self-motivated and really get myself started. And it took me years and years and much longer than another person. So I really just gave my heart to those students. One of those students was Chris Hoffman, who works at Gallaudet University today. And he works and volunteers with students in the School of Architecture. And we worked together for a specialty project that was part of the urban design competition for Buffalo waterfront. And we communicated really well. And I asked him to make the model to study the concept of the community plan and how it would relate between the old design and new design. So I had asked other 2 architects who could hear to join us to review and give us their feedback and commentary. And we learned from them and made a few changes. And then finally, we presented our design for the competition. And 2 days later, we got a letter informing us we won. And it was such an honor, and it really just stuck with me. From Buffalo, New York. And it, the team was amazing, and, we did our best, and that was how we started our group and how we established, the idea of mentorship and why it's important to incorporate that and have other students join us. So anyone who is a deaf architect in this country has had to really learn, the industry more of the hard way. So we're really encouraging these students to try to work with them, even if it's part-time or full-time or whatever they can do, even long-term, just so they can become familiar with the profession and understand all that architecture has to offer. So I hope that answered that question.
Yes, Robert, thank you. We have about 10 minutes left, so the same question is extended to Karen. Specifically from mentorship perspective, is it possible for deaf students, young employees, to contact you for advice, support, etc., even though you have a different disability?
So yes, I talk to young people often, and I would be happy to answer questions. I think the last slide had my contact information, but I can put my email in the chat. I think I can do that. And folks can reach out if they would like. I think I'm a little bit, shy about being able to advise on deaf experiences, because I myself have been hearing for so long, although now I'm down to only one good year, one hearing aid. So I certainly understand the challenges of, how hard it is to communicate in a group setting. Large meetings are very hard. And noisy background stuff, like out on a construction site, really hard. But in a way, I think these one-on-one kind of experiences, like on virtual meetings, I get a chance to see you speak, read your lips, and to have a quiet environment. And that's been kind of helpful for the last year. Maybe one of the few little benefits of COVID.
Thank you, Karen. Another question for the board. How will the executive director and staff be compensated? Is there money in WDA account to cover these expenses? I'll answer that. Yeah, that's fine.
I have a minute left. Oh, I'm sorry.
With this new organization restructure that we did, we are hoping that we will have the board members or directors to be more involved with the fundraising and hopefully support. But for right now, everyone is on volunteer basis. And excuse my error on the staff, I was meaning the volunteer staff that are willing. We have about 5 to 10 people that want to join WDA, volunteer helping to make WDA grow. Okay, now there's a last question for Karen. I'm sorry. Oh, I guess we're
I'm sorry,
out of
time is up. We're going to have to stop.
Okay.
Thank you so very much, Karen, to you. That was such a wonderful presentation, and we will definitely get a hold of you again if we have any additional information for you or you have for us. So please, whoever participated can get a hold of Karen with more questions. And we will have another meeting at 5, or another session at 5 today with 3 presenters. And the name is Designing for the Deaf. So please remember to participate at 5 o'clock, and we will see you guys at 5 p.m. today. Thank you, and have a nice rest and afternoon and a good day. And thank you so much.
I thank you again.
Thank you.